My wife tells me that I never listen, and yet I have hearings all the time. That joke did not play very well at daycare this morning. Speaking of daycare, today's podcast of the Best Florida Family Law Podcast, today's show is about daycare. Not about choosing which daycare is most appropriate. The show today in particular is not about which daycare is academically best for pre-K, or which daycare offers the most supervision or the best class ratio or the best price. Rather, today's show is about daycare in relation to who gets to choose the daycare and who pays for daycare. And depending on who pays for daycare, is there any sort of an implication that you need to be aware of there? Well, yes. Particularly in paternity cases. Let's start there. In a paternity case, it is unlikely that the parents have made this decision together. Most paternity cases are contested actions, where the parties either do not know each other very well, or at such a disconnect, at such loggerheads with each other, that it is nearly impossible to make these decisions through co-parenting and cooperatively. That is the circumstance in which people find themselves. Typically, the party that has the minor child or children, for the majority of the time, at least at the outset of a case, until some parenting plan is established or 50-50 is ordered by the court or some other result, generally the party that has the children more often will choose the daycare. In order to choose the daycare, if you have a parenting plan already, usually somebody will have to have school enrollment and some sort of school designation authority. Even though that applies to public school, it can also in some cases apply to choosing and selection of a daycare based on location. Hopefully the daycare is close by the primary time-sharing parent's house, or if you have 50-50, maybe somewhere in between to accommodate both parties' work schedules, rather than punishing your child and punishing the other side. In any event, specifically when it comes to daycare, the party that pays for the daycare, and here's really where the rubber hits the road, a favorite expression of mine with good reason, the party paying for the daycare bears the expense of $400, $500, $600, $700, $800, $900, $1,000, $1,300. It depends on the daycare and the rather massive expense, and that is just per child, which makes daycare a difficult proposition. But what alternative do you have? Stay home, earn no income as a single parent? You would not be able to afford that lifestyle. There are some programs in different counties and perhaps statewide that may be able to help offset the cost of daycare tuition, but that is not the purpose of today's program either. Specifically today, we want to talk about child support. If you are paying $1,000 a month for daycare, when child support is calculated, it is likely that you will get some kind of a credit/deduction for your daycare expenses, and then daycare will be divided on a pro rata basis. If the other party makes, and this is not an exact calculation, by the way, every program does this differently, and I am no mathematician. I rely on software just like most of us do in order to calculate child support. I do not do hand-by-hand calculations. They would be subject to error and individual user error, and I'm not interested in creating errors. I'm interested in total accuracy. Specifically here, when we talk about the daycare credit or deduction, however your software calculates for it, if there's a pro rata basis and the other party earns 60%, if you compare your incomes out of 100 and you earn 40%, they essentially earn more than you do. Their daycare contribution would be $600. And if you're paying for it in full, of course, then the child support calculations will reflect that. One solution people have come up with is to pay 50-50 for daycare. And why might that be a good solution to avoid controversy, additional fighting over child support, and whatnot? That may be a good solution because daycare does not last forever. Once your child is 4-ish, 5-ish, 6 if necessary, your child will very likely be going to VPK and or kindergarten. Once your child is in kindergarten, unless they're going to private school, which is not mandated by the family court, you will have a situation where the daycare expense will stop. There may be an after-school expense or a before-care expense, and it still may be, quote, expensive instead of reasonably affordable, but the cost will go down substantially, maybe altogether to zero. And in that case, do you still want to be the parent that's on the hook for paying massive amounts of child support because of daycare that might not even be an expense anymore? Daycare is for a limited time and a limited window. For example, if you get your minor child, if you have a parenting plan for your minor child around the ages of 3 or 4, then the daycare expense will last no longer than 1 to 2 years. Do you want to continue to pay child support beyond that? Or perhaps the better solution is to have daycare resolved beyond the child support calculations, unless the minor child is 6 months old or a year old or 2 years old. And in doing so, avoid having to go back to court to recalculate child support. Avoid having yet another court action that costs money and time and creates conflict and controversy. Daycare expenses can cost a fortune depending on your combined incomes or even separate incomes. That does not mean it has to cost a fortune in legal fees by fighting over it. Perhaps the best way for parties to manage this is to work cooperatively to pay daycare together, not just one party paying, or to have a separate agreement where daycare will be paid for by the parties beyond the child support calculations, as that may be seen by the party having to pay more and factor in daycare beyond the expiration of daycare eligibility as punitive. This has been the Best Florida Family Law Podcast episode about daycare. Nothing that we have stated here today should be construed as legal advice. It is not legal advice. This is simply for referential purposes, and this show is intended to be entertainment. We hope you've been educated a little bit about Florida family law. See you next time.